So, good morning, everyone. I figure you all have been reading a lot of this and that about the history of preservation, so I'm not going to try to do that. I'm just going to give you a bit from my point of view. My husband and I arrived in Brooklyn Heights in the fall of 1956, fresh out of college and law school, respectively. And we looked around and said, you know, this is a really nice place if they'd only fix it up and try to stop having all these ugly things that are creeping in. And we kind of fell into it immediately. By 1957, we were already a part of a group that was planning to propose Brooklyn Heights as a historic district. Now, that is different from being a landmark. There had been efforts at landmarking prior to that. You know, if you had a really great church or a nice city hall or something or other, that was an easy bet for a landmark. Packer was one.
Maybe talk a little louder, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, I can
put it closer.
Yeah.
Packer and St. Anne's and Holy Trinity and nice historical society and all were designated immediately because they were well-known landmarks with a capital L. But there had not been a big movement to have historic districts. And we thought that was perfect for Brooklyn Heights because it's such a wonderful amalgam of the 19th century. You can step back in parts of Brooklyn Heights and other areas, but we were here. Looking at it, and it's easily a movie set. That's why we get so many movies. It looks like a lot of places in various time frames if they just get the right group of houses. And anyway, we wanted to continue that. So we found it's just weird that a bunch of people our age and stage also decided to move to the city. I grew up in Nassau County in Garden City, which I'd been there, done that, kind of wasn't interested in continuing at that point. And turned out that, good friends from Michigan, good friends from all over the place, found their way to Brooklyn Heights, in part because of the convenience to Wall Street. It sure was great to have one subway stop to the office, compared to my father, who spent an hour on a train. That was kind of a waste of time. So we all found that appealing. The area was run down, and so things weren't too expensive. That was helpful too. And so we found places to live, and a few of us bought houses very quickly at modest prices. And it was all pretty good. But then how to get this done? Well, we consulted with the Municipal Art Society, who is a grand old organization that has been involved in all these issues, and they were focusing on the landmarking of individual buildings. And so they said, no, sounds good, we'll help you if we can. And everyone we talked to who had kind of the right background and slant said, terrific. The Brooklyn Heights Association, which is founded in 1910, at that point the whole board was male, and you had to be I would guess, at least 55 to get on the board. 60 or 70 was better. I picture them all, now this is really not true, with tummies and vests with gold watch chains. So we didn't know what their reaction would be, but miraculously, when the group that had formed talked to them about it, they said, terrific, we'll support you. Who knew? We thought they were going to be a bunch of old curmudgeons, and they really weren't. They jumped right in as best they could. So my husband, being a lawyer, worked a lot on the legislation aspect. The one we knew pretty well was Beacon Hill in Boston, which had had a zoning ordinance for a couple of years, and they'd given a lot of thought. So that was a good model. The National Trust in Washington had a couple of others. So we collected all the statutes we could find and, cherry-picked the best, of course, what was best for New York, and made up a proposed statute and presented that to the City Planning Commission. And the then new chairman said, it's not quite that easy. I think we have to have a citywide plan. We can't just do a little piecemeal here and piecemeal there. So that was kind of discouraging because we all thought that we were obviously the right candidate and all those other things should be put in advance and we should go ahead, but that was not to be. We had to wait until they got an ordinance that would work for other districts. Brooklyn Heights was the first historic district in New York City. Greenwich Village, a couple years later, was the second, which is an obvious choice. And we now have over 100, I think it's something like 110 historic districts in the city of New York. I haven't gotten the latest count because it changes constantly, but it's been a success. But that, in order to persuade everyone of the rightness of this, we were tipped off that there was this great architectural historian in the community by the name of Clay Lancaster. And he was a great guy, but quite unusual. He absolutely would not have a phone. He said that was just totally uncivilized to have a phone ringing at inconvenient times. So one night we traipsed over to his apartment and slipped a letter under his door, and he called back and said, sure, he'd help. Well, he did the most enormous job. He was already doing a survey of houses in Brooklyn Heights. And this is the second edition. If you ever see one for sale, they're out of print. Grab it, because they're not easy to find. It's called Old Brooklyn Heights, New York's First Suburb. And that goes, kind of suggests, he did a detailed analysis of 619 century-old houses. And why he stopped at 1860 is very simple. He got tired of sitting in the the Historical Society, then called the Long Island Historical Society, going through city directories and filling out index cards every time he found an address that was relevant to Brooklyn Heights. And he just said, I've done it. And after that, the city directories got much bigger. And he said, that's somebody else's job for another generation. I don't think it's ever going to get done, but you never know. A couple other books are in the making. But he was a wonderful educator for us all, because I didn't know about the basic styles of of architecture for the 19th century that would appear in the city. And he did these marvelous slides and slideshows. I was usually the projectionist, because in those days we didn't have a remote. But he didn't like using the remote anyway, because he liked to stride around and declaim about everything, and that would hold him back. So I was mostly the projectionist. We gave that talk many times because it was so well received. And people came in kind of like, oh yeah, okay, and go out and think, wow, that is really exciting. I live in a Greek Revival house, or I live in a Gothic Revival house. And people started to realize the details that formed the popular styles in Brooklyn Heights. Now, I would like to digress a little bit about, just quickly, the history of Brooklyn. You know this probably, but aside from the fact that it's based on, 6 towns, Dutch towns in the 1600s that gradually got together, the village of Brooklyn was by the ford at what's now the Brooklyn Bridge, and gradually grew out. And by 1834, Brooklyn was a city, and the other villages, some of whom became cities like Flatbush, were added eventually to the borough, so that by before 1898, when we got absorbed into the city of New York, everything was part of the Kings County or Brooklyn. But it was not all at once. And people used to say to me, what on earth is the Long Island Historical Society doing in Brooklyn? And I would have to take a deep breath and say, have you ever looked at a map? Brooklyn is on Long Island. It's the westernmost county. And this kind of amazed look comes on people's faces. You mean, is that really so? Growing up in Nassau County, the line was Nassau County. Anything east of that line was Long Island, and the rest of it was the city. And you didn't, compare them. But in reality, Brooklyn and Queens are both on Long Island, will remain so forever. But the historical fact is kind of important, because that's why we have the courts here, why Brooklyn had so many of its own facilities. It was a separate city, third or fourth largest in the country. So they had a public library, they had a museum, they had a children's aid society, anything you mentioned, Brooklyn had its own. And those roots continue today, and it is kind of odd you're saying the New York Public Library is just a stone's throw away. Why aren't we all one? Well, the history is they're different, and nobody's bothered to put them together. It might happen one time, but I certainly don't see the Brooklyn Museum merging with the Metropolitan or something. They have their own programs and histories. So that's just a quick thumbnail of that. But anyway, the point of all of that is in Brooklyn in the mid-19th century, it was a very prosperous place. And if you built a house, you built a nice house because generally in this area, it was an affluent group. So when we came in the 50s, they were still nice houses, even though run down. And we were lucky because there was really good stock to work with. But they were really run down in the most. The center part of Brooklyn Heights was continuously inhabited by people all along. But I know my parents were part of a generation that moved to the suburbs because that's what was assumed. If you had children, you'd go to the suburbs. You wouldn't stay in the dirty city. The other thing you should bear in mind, that Brooklyn was considered safer and more wholesome. This is the city of churches. And families came to Brooklyn and lived proper lives. So that's another reason why we have so many churches and beautiful churches. And the ones in Brooklyn Heights were done by famous, for the most part, famous 19th century architects that are on, everybody's lists. So of something to save anyway. So we're lucky there. Too bad we're not going to church more, but that's another issue. A lot of them need a little more support. But so anyway, what happened was that my husband was busy worrying about the law aspect, but how do we prove that this is a suitable site? Well, Clay did this that tells, the date of each house and the style and so on up to 1860. That left another 600 buildings. This was 600, so. So it fell to me to go through the real estate register, and this is the old time style, make out a 3x5 index card for every property in Brooklyn Heights, and then to enter Clay's information on those cards that he had done, and then find some other way of recording the other buildings. And some of them, if they're pre-building department records, there aren't any handy, so you have to estimate. So I spent a bunch of Saturdays walking and driving Clay around saying, what would you say the date of that is? And we had categories like 1860 to 1880, brilliant categories like that. And then when we got to the 20th century, we had pretty good records at the building department and some volunteers, really nice one man. They used to have all the old files down in the 5th basement in the municipal building, and they didn't allow women down there because apparently the people working down there next to the boiler found it so hot they didn't dress properly. And so he would go down there and make notes. So we know who the architects of most of the apartment buildings were and so on. So we eventually got all that. Then armed with that, we made up 2 maps. And these were not intended to be masterpieces, but they were about this high. And they were an outline that I've forgotten now who, organization put out for regional planning or something or other that had the outlines of buildings. So then I would go through my cards and put a different color on each square to designate Greek Revival, Gothic Revival, whatever. We had a style map and a date map, 2 separate maps. And we trotted those maps around all over the place saying, see, we know what we've got and it's good. And so that was a good strategy, but a lot of work. And a lot of people who were very talented, spent a lot of time coloring in boxes on these maps for us. Kind of a little CAD would have been a help, but we didn't have one of those. A computer would have really been a help because it had been so much easier. But anyway, that's the way it was done in the 50s. And so if you want to see one of those maps, it is on exhibit at the Museum of the City of New York. I don't know if your program will get you to this exhibit called Activist New York. And we are pictured in it, and it's sort of interesting. The other things they describe are totally different activities, but anyway, it's sort of interesting. I think the museum is fun too. If you haven't been there, you'll enjoy it. Then I would do like the Brooklyn Historical Society has been alluded to. This year is not only at the 150th anniversary of the Brooklyn Historical Society, which is what we now call the Long Island Historical Society. We just had to make it a little simpler. You know, in 1862, there weren't any historical societies except Brooklyn, so everybody sent everything here. But today, there's, you know, a historical society in practically every village on Long Island, so we don't have to try to take on all of that. It's a big enough job to try to do the main currents in Brooklyn. Overwhelming, I might say, because, you know, there's always a group that deserves recognition and is doing something interesting that maybe we want to have an exhibit of or do something about. Anyway, this year happens to be not that, but the 150th anniversary coming up anyway of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. And they have been planning for several years doing this In Pursuit of Freedom exhibit, but it's only kind of the tip of the iceberg. But this talks about abolitionists in Brooklyn. Not only the famous ones like Henry Ward Beecher, the preacher at Plymouth Church, and a couple of senior merchant types, but some of the actual black folks who were working on that issue also, business people and so on. So it was, anyway, there's some interesting things there. I recommend you go there when you can. And there's a whole series of programs, many of which I find interesting, but there's quite a variety of them. And the way you can check these, aside from going there, is brooklynhistory.org. A lot of programs that are in the evening. We have a board member who is with the Brooklyn Brewery, served Brooklyn Brewery beer, which is a nice tie-in. So, for example, last Thursday night was a hip-hop program. One of our board members is tied in with that, Wes Jackson. And tomorrow night is Pat Kiernan and Jake Dobbin, Brooklyn on Brooklyn. I don't know what exactly they're going to talk about. And next week, on Saturday, is Color Between the Lines, Irondale Ensemble Performance, which is all about the anti-slavery work. But I'm more interested in the program that comes up on the 6th, Adaptive Reuse in Brooklyn, Rooms and Objects, so on. Anyway, there's a lot of stuff there. Of course, I recommend the Brooklyn Museum, and a lot of people go in and look at the current exhibits, which are nice, but I would just want you to find a few moments to go to the period rooms if you want to see what a 19th century house looked like, the decor, which was quite elegant of some of them. And they also have 2 Dutch houses, whole houses in the museum. So they're interesting to see. They date much earlier. But there is another Dutch house in Prospect Park that you can visit. And there are a bunch of others, but they're not as close by. I don't know how far away you all go. But anyway, it was a busy time. The thing that was, to me, amazing is everybody got this spirit that it had to happen. There was no question. And just, we're going to do it somehow. And we're going to get out of the box. People say, no, we're going to go on with it and make it happen. I see the same, went to something last night, which was a little overwhelming. Paul Mellon lecture on Rangoon. Beautiful, beautiful place. And they have no zoning that means anything. And, you know, somebody could put up a 30-story building next to these glorious whatever they are, temples or something. And the man spoke, and he's working his tail off trying to get things going well there. So there's no end to preservation fights, it seems. But we have had lots of them in Brooklyn Heights. One of them, a confusing time, was early on. One of our local highly respected nonprofits, the Watchtower, wanted to take down a bunch of buildings in the middle of Brooklyn Heights and put up a 12-story building, which seemed inappropriate to everyone there. And we finally talked them out of it. And then they did a plan that looked like some kind of a suburban bank. We thought it was awful. And tried to persuade them to do a better design and gave them some suggestions of architects. And miraculously, they rose to the occasion and did a really nice job. It's the building between Clark and Pineapple, I think, on Columbia Heights. And Ulrich Franzen designed it and did a nice job, and it's kind of unusual. They kept the fronts of some brownstones, but they're all offices and stuff behind, and then built a new building, which is quite different from anything else, but its scale is good for the area. And scale is so important in a historic district. Anyway, out of that controversy, or at the same time, we persuaded the city to give us a 50-foot height limitation, which is a wonderful thing because everybody always wants to put up 30 stories if they're a proper developer, it seems. And so it's not happening right in the center of Brooklyn Heights. We did have to step back from the Cadman Plaza development, which was the Cadman Plaza, was not a design we all were wild about, and we all kind of liked the old buildings that were there. I mean, there was where Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass was printed, and there were antique shops, and it was kind of these nice 1850s, 40s, and 50s store buildings that had living spaces above, and there was nothing particularly wrong with them. It's just they wanted to, Mr. Moses wanted to have a big slum clearance project there. His plan was to have efficiency apartments, which would be suitable for single people before they moved to the suburbs. And we said, hey, wait a minute, this has got to be family-size apartments and more suitable for our present and future population, and also some income, rent abatement. And miraculously, the group did win on that one. So I'm not wild about, they don't fit in particularly with the Heights, but they have their advantages too. So there's currently a controversy, I don't know how it's going to come out, about the movie theater in Brooklyn Heights. The owner wants to put a taller building. First he wanted 12 stories, and everybody said, no, 50 feet. And that's a big help. And what that's going to turn out to be, I am not up to date on. But, it was the building that was built as a store, I believe, some kind of a market or something, a one-story building. And it is, period. But it was never a fancy building. So you get into this discussion, is it okay to take down a simple, unimportant building just because it's not too grand? It's hard call. We say that Brooklyn Heights Historic District is a whole, and you shouldn't nibble away at the streetscape. The old buildings, even if they're not too high quality, contribute to the appearance. I mean, Henry Street, where the movie theater is, was always a shopping street, and that fit in. And too much glass and metal and so on doesn't sound appealing, but who knows how that's going to come out. But there are endless, absolutely endless discussions about what is appropriate once you get the landmark designation, because it's hard to determine how far to go with upgrading and improvement meeting the current needs. And we're, by the way, the tradition in Brooklyn Heights is that a replacement building should be of the best style that's available today. It should be contemporary. But it should tie in scale-wise, and if possible, window lines and so on, so that it doesn't stand out like a sore thumb, but just be a pleasant addition to the streetscape. So that's always tricky. What is a pleasant and nice design? Doing modern architecture well is really hard, I think. So I don't envy him that task. It's much easier to, stick with the old if possible. I will also just want to put in a plea. The landmarks law does not cover interiors here. In England it does, and some other places it does. And we have this rash of people just stripping the inside of a building, really thoughtlessly, because they're not aware kind of what they're doing. Usually what happens, to my experience, is they strip out the parlor, take all the ceiling moldings down and so on, and then go in, and pretty soon the decorator arrives and the family arrives and says, "This is an uncomfortable room. What are we going to do?" So what do? They put in ceiling moldings, they took out some nice ones, they put in the lumberyard ones that aren't as nice. Did we really get anywhere on that one? Not really. It's better to go very, very slow in taking out historic details. And because you very likely, since you have to keep the windows where they are, the proportions of the room were pretty tried and true over the centuries, and you just are not likely to improve it. It's one thing to have a new house, but if you're working in an existing house, and we used to have more interaction with architects before they started than we do now, but I think we need to do more with architecture schools too, to tell them to be a little more respectful of their predecessors and realize that there's more to it than meets the eye. If you go into a nice 19th century house, everything kind of ties together and you relax and you feel perfectly fine. If it's been too much altered, it's not quite so appealing. And usually then people start trying to figure out ways of making it more comfortable and more, and it turns out to be going back, usually. The other thing, which is a minor thing, but don't take out too many doors. People take out the doors to the hallway and think, oh, it's going to be nice and open. Yeah, on a night like tonight, it's going to be nice and open. Everyone in the parlor, if you have people over, it's going to freeze. Not freeze, but it'll be much colder. If you have a door you can close on a cold day, when somebody's delivering something or bringing something in, is very practical. And there are sound issues too. If you're having a group over for, well, say, a little concert, you don't necessarily want to hear the baby crying on the third floor. And so it's nice to be able to close the door. And vice versa. Then also doors to rooms. In most of the Heights houses, well, it's true of the whole downtown Brooklyn area, there are rooms from the hallway that are hall rooms. And sometimes people add them onto the main room on the floor and don't give any thought to the fact that sooner or later needs will change, and you want a separate room for the baby, or you want a separate room, you're elderly, you want a nurse, and you want a little separation, And it's just better to not tamper with too much with the original layouts, so they really do work well. The other thing that went on for a while was taking off stoops. Stoops serve a really good function. They separate. I have a nephew who keeps talking about my front back door, which is the underneath the stoop door. That's for deliveries, the gardener, all that. If you have to bring everybody through that door, it's kind of a nuisance. It's better to have the company go up the stoop and go in that door. And so in the end, a lot of stoops have been put back in Brooklyn Heights, not only for appearances. The houses look better, but they also work better if you have a family living there. It doesn't matter much if it's just one or two people, but if you have kids running in and out and snowy clothes and whatever, you can imagine. It's a more practical thing. So I had some other thought that's left me. I'm going to see if anybody has any questions they would like to propose, and I'll see see if there's anything else I can throw at you. But the one thing we did was go through all the buildings on Cadman Plaza and pick out the architectural details, like mantels and some moldings and stuff, but not too many. We couldn't have the way of dealing with it. And we got a nice Columbia student on his spring break to take out these things gently, and they all were taken over to the Brooklyn Historical Society, which at that point the first floor was empty at that moment. And we had a sale, and it was the most backward sale. You could buy a mantle if you had a house, you were a first priority buyer if you had a house in Brooklyn Heights of the same period. And you were a second priority person if you lived nearby. And if you didn't have a house that was even close to that, you got to be third. I mean, you know, we were trying to get suitable details to the right places. And we charged something. It wasn't much, but we were trying to cover the cost of the student to do all this work. And he had a couple other friends that helped him. But I got my picture in the paper looking at a mantle, and we saved that. I didn't do much of that. The people make a lot of the Penn Station demolition, which was really terrible. Growing up on Long Island, I went through there on and off for years. But that was kind of after the fact. People say that's what started it. No, that's what got the mayor to sign the bill. But we'd been working at it for several years before that started. I do remember walking down Atlantic Avenue with a sign once, and I can't remember anymore what it was. It was something about killing the bill, because my daughter was about 2.5 at the time, and she learned how to say "kill the bill" from her stroller. But it was, I don't know, they had some crazy proposal for Atlantic Avenue. I think we headed it off, but I don't remember now anymore what it was. But I did not go picket Penn Station. I was at an event last week where they showed the new film on Penn Station. I don't know how many of you saw it on PBS. Yes, we were seeing it at the sports bar at the same time. An event sponsored by the New York Preservation Archives Project, NIPAP for short. If any of you have an important or know of an archive that should be saved, they are prepared to try to facilitate that. So anyway, they thought we'd all heard this producer speak at another occasion and thought it would be fun, but I didn't realize it was going to be on television at the exact same moment. So but anyway, this nice architect, Mr. Sampton, got up and talked about starting everything with he was picketing at Penn Station. That was a couple of years. We were doing it a couple of years before that. But there was such an uproar. The good part about that uproar was that the mayor just had to say, okay, I'll sign it. You know, we can't hold you waiting any longer. So we proposed it, and they said, no, we have to give commerce its opportunity. I mean, they didn't say that, but that's too complicated with all the banks there. So now on Clark Street we're having the controversy because one of the people that ran Eamon Dorian wants to put in a sports bar at 74 Clark Street. And frankly, I am so appalled. 12 feet wide and no kitchen, right across the street from 1,300 kids. Now, does that make any sense? I think there are two other places, plus a liquor store on the corner. It's not that it's a dry spot, but you don't need it open till 4 a.m., thank you very much. So I went to one hearing, actually, and we're going to go to the next one and try to say this isn't a good spot for a bar like that. And please, don't approve it. Why can't they just have a little store or even a restaurant? But there's no room for a kitchen. I mean, it's so small. So, and there's no ventilation and all of that. So it's a bad idea. There must be a travel agency, anybody who could use that space if they don't want to use it. It belongs to the same people as Taza, so they could re-expand Taza if they chose. Historical Society, yes. Pierpont and Clinton. The nice red terracotta building. And we're very pleased to have just completed another renovation so that the first floor room in the back, or the facing south, the Pierpont Street, the Montague Street side, is a great spot for talks now. We're having a ton of talks, and it works really well. So we're pleased at that. And there's some other exhibition space down below that's been renovated. So there's an exhibit on architecture downstairs at the moment. I think it's landmarks, includes other areas. It was a loan exhibit that we were offered. It was convenient to take it while we weren't doing something else, you know. Well, that's a voluntary act, changing windows. I mean, it's up to the owner to decide if it's time to change the windows. Then you apply for, if I get you right, then you apply for approval of the windows you have selected. And they have the right to say no or suggest some change. But I don't think the Landmarks Commission has the right to tell you you have to change your windows now. It's the building department or housing, you know. HPD would say your windows are leaking. It's a health hazard or something, but it's sort of a different track. But it's hard to find suitable windows for historic buildings. In many of the Brooklyn Heights houses, 6 panes over 6 panes is the predominant feature. And they are not keen to put in 1 over 1s that are nice and double glazed. And you're putting in these little pieces of plastic to try to fool you. It's very, very unlikely to fool you. Somebody must be able to do that well, I don't know, but sometimes it looks really terrible to see these little bits of plastic in there. If you're far enough away, you wouldn't notice, but up close, they don't look very good. Also, storm windows. Storm windows really make sense in this climate. So you know, the 3 sash ones, I mean, you have 2 storms and then 1 screen, and you rotate them back and forth depending on the season. But some of those are really hideous. So it's tricky, and I'm in the market actually for some that are very inconspicuous, because I feel the drafts coming in. It would make sense to close them off, but I haven't done it yet. There were other fights that I could bore you with, like Brooklyn Bridge Park. That was a whole issue, and getting the Port Authority to give up the idea of some 30-story buildings there. Well, that's better than the 30-story buildings right in front that were proposed. So, you know, give people a chance, and they have a tendency to propose big buildings in the wrong place. Anyway, thank you all.
Thank you so much.